Hi, welcome. I'm sitting here with the one and only Alan Gow, Chief Executive of the British Touring Car Championship. You've been the main man for a long time. You've made that series hugely successful. How long in total have you been in charge? I know you took a break, but just tell us a little bit about that journey.
I took it over in 1992, and I had a 2.5-year break between end of 2000 and 2003. So yeah, you'd have to do the math, but it's something like 33 years or something like that. It's long enough for me to be deemed as being a one-trick pony.
And a BTCC lifer.
You had to stop yourself from agreeing with that, didn't you? Yes, obviously.
Yeah, and you've grown into the role and you've made it what you want it to be.
I don't think I'm any better in the role now than I was 30 years ago.
Palpably
so
not.
I don't know if I've grown into the role.
I'm joking.
I don't know if I've grown into the role, but I can do it with my eyes shut. If that's the determination of how good you are at your job.
Yeah, you've got used to it. Put it that way.
I've got used to it, and I've surrounded myself with the right people.
Yeah.
And so the people that work for me have all been with me for a very long time.
And I can confirm that because I, work with them now, and great crew, small but great crew.
Yeah, very small.
So you've been there as a constant for 30 odd years. But of course the world has changed and motorsport has to change with it. And one of the things that has to change is the way that motorsport exists in a world where the environment is under threat. So tell us a little bit about what the BTCC is doing in that regard. Well,
so the BTCC is probably no different to how all businesses operate in today's environment or today's world. We all transact our business in a totally different way to how we did it in the 90s or 80s or whatever it was, or even the thousands. So obviously sustainability, the environment and sustainability is a great driver at the moment and will do for probably the rest of our days in the way that the sport and business conducts itself. So we have to take a responsible attitude to it. We're a pretty easy target for environmentalists to have a shot at us. So I've always thought it better to be on the front foot in that respect and take some positive action to ensure that we stay at least with the game, if not ahead of the game, and show that we take these sort of things seriously. And all the partners we deal with all want the same too. You talk to any major corporation today about getting involved in the BTCC or that sort of arrangement, and they'll all, one of the first things I'll ask you is your sustainability credentials. And really you don't get through the front door unless you can prove to them and show them that you take that seriously. And after that, then they'll sort of let you in the door to the second stage of the discussions.
Absolutely, and as you touched on in your answer, I mean, motorsport is particularly vulnerable to criticism in this area, in some way unfairly, because we all know that the environmental footprint of an event, the actual fuel that's burned by the cars going around, 20, 30 cars going around for an hour or so, is not much compared with 30, 40, 50,000 people getting there. Or in the case of many sports, but not the BTCC, flying people and cars all over the world. For instance, typically Formula One, but not only Formula One, the World Rally Championship and various other series. Now, it is just worth saying, because it is an environmental credit for the BTCC. Everybody, all the drivers who drive in the BTCC, I believe, live in the United Kingdom. And every single car is transported from a factory in the United Kingdom to every single race. That's true, isn't it?
That's correct. The hint is in the name. It's the British Touring Car Championship. So we don't go beyond Britain. So everything we do is by road. There's one event up in Knockhill in Scotland where maybe 30 people might fly to that event because they need to get back quickly on a Sunday night or whatever. But the vast majority use their cars or the team transport to get up there. So we don't use planes apart from that one occasion I mentioned to you at Knockhill. But that's a very, very small amount of people. So
and
yes,
actually you often drive, don't you?
I always drive.
Yeah, and it's 450 miles from here.
Yeah, look, it's a day. It's you make a bit of a day of it, stop off at all the dodgy services on the way. I actually quite enjoy it for some odd reason.
Yeah.
And I take the scenic route up. I just don't take the motorways. I go up the east coast and through the Scottish borders and everything else. So
Jim Clark territory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And John Clellan territory, actually.
Absolutely.
He's through there.
Yeah.
So I always drive up there and drive back on the Monday. I get sick of air travel. We've all done enough air travel in our time.
You know, the only time I feel herded is in an airport. You know, check in 2.5 hours before to do a 1.5 hour flight.
And that's okay if you're doing a long haul flight.
Of course.
It's all part of the journey. But you know, to spend basically 5 hours travelling just for a short haul, by the time you get to the airport, check in, get on your flight, get out the other end, it's just a whole hassle factor. It's just a lot easier just to sit in a car with some nice music or good company and drive up there.
And I don't think you're sitting in a 1961 Morris Minor, are you?
What have you got against the 1961 Morris Minors? No, Porsche supply our cars, so we have a very decent set of wheels to go up and down.
Now, something that is more overtly environmentally motivated, which is the sustainable fuels. Now, you this year have embraced sustainable fuels on one of the cars in 2 of the races. That's Silverstone and Brands Hatch. And for qualifying, all 3 races across the whole weekend. So just tell us a little bit about how that came about, the research you did, the motivation, and in fact delivering it, because it didn't have a performance deficit at all, did it?
Not at all. So this is we use a control fuel which is manufactured to us. It's an unbranded fuel. It's manufactured by a company called Haltermann Carless, who do a lot of motorsport fuels. And for the last 2 or 3 years, probably 3 years, we've been talking about increasing the sustainability component within the fuel. This year we had a 20% sustainable fuel, which is double what a road car is. So your road car normally has 10% sustainable components in the fuel. Ours is 20%. So we did 20%, and we always wanted to go to a fully sustainable fuel. Always. That was a goal from probably 3 years ago. So Haltermann Carless took it upon themselves to do all the research and development, because they would supply the fuel not just for us, but many other series around the world, as well as some of our support races. But they did all the research and development on it. They knew the parameters we wanted, which was no performance drop, no issues with reliability, and no problems with other elements of the fuel system, like fuel lines and everything else, because some sustainable fuels are very bad on that. So they knew the elements, they knew the guidelines of which we would agree to having a sustainable fuel. And I think we are now at the 7th or 8th iteration of it. They would do a fuel, we would test it on dynos, we'd come back with, this has been going on for quite a while. This is not just something we've done this year. And they finally came with a fuel that they said ticks all those boxes. So we gave it to all of our engine builders, the 3 or 4 engine builders that are involved in the championship. They tested on their dyno. They gave it the thumbs up and said, yep, no problems with the engine, no problems with performance, no problems with reliability. So then there's nothing like testing it on track. So we were never going to get one of the leading teams, if you like, to test it, because we wouldn't want to do anything that compromises their championship. So we asked Unlimited Motorsport if they would test it for us in Darrell's car. Immediately said yes. Maybe they were hoping it was a performance advantage, I don't know, but they immediately said yes. And it's been absolutely problem-free. So now we have got a fuel which we think ticks all the boxes.
And to be precise, you're talking about the whole field would have 100% sustainable fuel.
And not only the BTCC, so it's all the BTCC. And if we do it, more than likely, most of the support races will do it too. So
you mean the Porsches, Formula 4?
Correct.
All of that.
Minis, they will probably do it too.
That's impressive, and I'm so pleased that you've managed to gradually, but it's a lot of hard work, get yourself to that position. Anyway, it's been great to see.
I can expand on that.
But please do. While I have a glass of water, please expand on it.
So this is not unusual for the BTCC. We were the first championship of its type in the world going back to the very early 90s, 92, 93, to introduce catalytic converters in the car, because catalytic converters then became nearly the standard in road cars. So we were the first championship, saloon car, touring car championship in the world to introduce catalytic converters and unleaded fuel in the car. For that very reason, we thought we need to be relevant. And when that's the way the world is going, we need to be a part of that. And through the history of the BTCC, if I just talk about fuels, we've had biofuels, we have had LPG fuels, so we've had all sorts of, and diesel, we've had all sorts of different fuels available during the course of the championship. And we're probably the only one that has experimented with all of these things going forward and allowed those cars to race as a demonstration of what different fuels can do within motorsport. So I'm pretty proud of the fact that in 30 odd years, we've been at the forefront of all this. And if we are the first touring car championship, major touring car championship in the world to have 100% sustainable fuel, and by the way, there's different types of sustainable fuel. There's proper sustainable fuels that are made up of the elements which are truly sustainable, not just chucking some ethanol in the mix. If we're the first major touring car championship in the world to run 100% sustainable fuel, that's a great feather in our cap. But it's not unusual because we've done all those things before.
Absolutely. So you're proud, but you should be proud. Everyone concerned with the BTCC should be proud in that regard. But actually, it's building on a BTCC tradition.
Yeah, I don't know if it's tradition would be the right word, but it's.
But you've got form for this.
We've got form for this. It's something we're happy to experiment.
Okay, well look, you've gone back through the years talking about catalytic converters and unleaded fuel and those things, and now we're talking about fully sustainable fuel. That's the past. What about the future? Now, I'm not asking you to get your gaze into your crystal ball, but the next 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, how do you see actually motorsport itself, but also the BTCC going in this area?
I don't know. I don't even know if anyone can answer that question. You'll end up going where it takes you.
Where what politics takes you, or science, or commercials?
No, science and engineering.
Yeah,
takes you. Politics. I doubt if politics will be a driver for us, because if we went down the political route, it would all be in EVs, which are proving to be not the answer. So the hydrogen is probably the next big thing. Certainly for motorsport. I think EVs have a very limited value within motorsport, and we're seeing it with, you've got Formula E and
Extreme E.
Extreme E, but in fact Extreme E finishes this year. There's no more Extreme E, it goes into hydrogen. There's been a very little take up of EVs into motorsport for all the reasons we know about. You know, they don't last very long, they're very heavy and everything else. So I think hydrogen is probably the next big thing, and hydrogen can be either a hydrogen fuel cell attached to an EV motor or a hydrogen fuel cell attached to an internal combustion engine. It takes all different elements. I think that's probably the next big thing, and we will happily open the doors to a hydrogen development within our championship going forward.
Right, and we don't know when, but it's something that you're foreseeing.
I think I've got a fairly good idea of when. I think it'll probably be in the next 2 to 3 years.
Right.
That we would have a hydrogen element within the championship, and it may be only a couple of cars running to hydrogen as part of the development exercise. I can't imagine it'll be the whole field swapping over, but I think you'll start to see, and you're seeing in other classes, Le Mans are allowing a hydrogen car next year. I think you'll see that creeping in now as part of the development exercise for hydrogen going forward. When we go to a completely new type of a fuel and engine, I'll be long out of this business by then. But certainly for the foreseeable future, for the next 5 years, it'll be a more fuel efficient internal combustion engine with 100% sustainable fuel, possibly hydrogen as well, possibly hybrid as well. There's all those sort of mixes. You can take some elements or all of those elements. I don't know if you can have a hydrogen a hydrogen ICE with a hybrid.
Sustainability bingo.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm probably overreaching that. But yeah, as I said, one or more of those elements will become part of our championship going forward. But we'll just see where it leads us. Who knew 10 or 15 years ago that we'd be talking about what we're talking about now? If you said to me 15 years ago, look, you'll be running hybrids, you'll be running 100% sustainable fuel, and you'll possibly be talking about hydrogen, I'd tell you to go and have a cup of tea and a good lie down.
You've often said that to me anyway.
You should do. But so who knows what the future, and I'm not an engineer, I'm not privy to all that goes on in that respect, but we'll just see where it all takes us.
Well, it's great. Sorry, I interrupted you. You were just going to add something.
I was just going to say that the overriding element of all of that is there's two things that are the drivers for that, and that is cost control, because whilst you can go off on an engineering bent of introducing all these sort of things, the costs go out through the roof, the teams go broke doing it, and the racing suffers. So you'll only introduce those things, one of those things or two of those things or whatever you introduce, if it can be well controlled cost-wise, and that it doesn't take away from the exciting racing element that we have. Because we're not an engineering exercise, we're short, sharp, exciting racing. So I'll let the Le Mans experts do a 24-hour engineering exercise to work out how good a car is over a distance. And it doesn't have to be competitive in those sort of exercises. But in BTCC, it's short, sharp, exciting racing. So whatever we introduce and whatever we use has to have that as the overriding goal. And I'll never introduce an element into it that takes away from that.
Absolutely, and in fact, that's how you've introduced everything. I mean, we just mentioned hybrids, but you only brought them in if they added to the show.
Yeah.
And they did do.
And they did. Look, the first year we introduced hybrids, to be honest, we had a lot of problems in bedding the system down, or Cosworth had a lot of problems in bedding the system down, and the teams were incredibly patient. But it's what you do when you start any new regulation. So the first year was a bit of a nightmare.
2022.
Yep. Reliability and all that sort of stuff. But you sort of expect a bit of that. It didn't fundamentally alter the results of the championship or anything. It was just a pain getting there. 23 was fine. Reliability was fine. And then we stepped up the element of hybrid this year, so it made a much bigger difference in the racing. And we've seen fantastic racing this year, all through the season. And hybrid is a lot to do with that.
Actually, since you've raised that subject, let's just spend a bit of time on it. This season has been absolutely fantastic, hasn't it? I mean, multiple winners, championship showdown involving two drivers that were most likely to win, but others in contention as well. Great season it has been. You mentioned the word relevance about 5-10 minutes ago. I want to ask you a bit more about that particular word because, yes, we've discussed at some length, and rightly so, the environmental credentials, sustainability credentials, and so on of the BTCC now and in the past and in the future. But relevance is always very important as far as I've been concerned as a BTCC, you know, someone who's enjoyed watching the BTCC for many, many years. And it always has been. Now, I just want to, you can answer it obviously in whichever way you wish to answer it, but I love Formula One, and I always have done, and I worked in Formula One for years and years and years. But Formula One cars have never really been relevant. You know, Lewis Hamilton's Mercedes does not look like the Mercedes that you can buy and drive on the road. But the BTCC has always had cars that, you know, your current Vauxhalls and Toyotas and BMWs look like, because they are, the Toyotas and Vauxhalls and BMWs that you can buy on the road. So tell us a little bit about relevance in any sense of the way you perceive it and why it's important for the BTCC.
So touring car racing or saloon car racing, whichever part of the world you're looking at, is called different names, but that's always been its main driver is its relevance to what people drive on the buy and drive on the road. So, you know, a person who drives up in their Toyota Corolla can proudly go and stand on the bank, basking in glorious sunshine, being the English weather we're having, and be proud of the car they're driving, because there it is racing and beating, you know, a BMW or something else. So road relevance has always been important to us, and that's why we're very strict on the way that the cars look, that they can't deviate too much from the road car specifications as far as, you know, width and length and everything else. And you know, we place heavy restrictions on the aerodynamics and everything else, so they keep that road relevance.
That's also got a cost benefit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we're very strict on those elements. We don't want them to go away from looking like the car that you or I or anyone else can identify with. And that's also important for the manufacturers. That's important for sponsors, because some of the sponsors that are involved in the championship, some of the major sponsors who are involved in the championship, are involved in road car sales and marketing and parts and everything else.
Well, the title sponsor, Quick Fit, for instance.
Very good. And people like Napa who sponsor, you know, that's all. They sell parts for road cars. They don't sell parts for racing cars.
Yeah.
So, and Quick Fit, you know, they do brakes and tyres for road cars, not racing cars. So it's all part of the relevance. The people can relate to it standing on the spectator banks. The sponsors can relate to it. The costs are controlled, and it creates really good racing. There's very few top-level motorsport that is actually road relevant anymore. You say Formula One, but Formula 4 isn't road relevant. Formula 2, Formula 3 isn't road relevant. Le Mans cars are not. They don't look like anything that you or I are going to buy. So all the sort
Formula E isn't.
All the top championships in the world don't really have a road relevance. They'll pretend they do, and they'll pretend there's some
NASCAR
engine.
probably has the closest.
True.
Yeah.
But I was sort of talking about. I'm being a bit Europe-centric.
Yeah.
It's really only rally cars.
And by the way, I should say Aussie V8s. I should have mentioned
Very
as well.
much so.
Anyway, carry on.
So we're not the only ones that are road relevant, and there's a reason why those NASCAR and Australian V8s and ourselves are successful, for the very reasons I gave you. You know, there's a reason why NASCAR is more successful in the USA than what IndyCar is, because the people can. You've been to NASCAR race, I assume. People stand in the grandstands and they're wearing a Chevy, you know, T-shirt, and they drive up in a Chevy Blazer or whatever, and they can relate to it. And it's the same with Australian V8s. You know, back in the old Holden and Ford battles, it was, you know, 90% of the car park was full of Holdens and Fords. Going and
you were either a Ford guy or you were a Holden guy.
No other choice. There's only two of them in it.
Yeah.
But you know, as I said, 90% of the car park at a race meeting was just full of Holden and Ford. It's very tribal. So they could relate to it. And it's the same with us. You know, we have people that follow the cars rather than the drivers. So if a driver shifts teams, they'll stay and follow that team. BMW is a good example. The WSR, Dick Bennett's BMW team.
West Surrey Racing.
Correct.
Yeah.
Their supporters will stay with that team regardless of which driver goes through it. So that's just it's the tribalism of it.
Well, you've actually got a grand tradition of this. You objected to the word tradition before. And I think you're old enough to deserve the word tradition, because you started off, you cut your motorsport teeth in Aussie V8s,
Sure.
didn't you?
Well, they weren't Aussie V8s in those days, but
Australian touring
Australian
cars.
touring car racing.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was a team owner, team manager, team owner, and then I was part of the group that took ownership of the series, to control the series, which up until only 2 years ago they still had ownership of the series. So we formed the association that took over the commercial rights of the series and grew it to what it was. So I was one of the founders of that association, and I'm Australian, so that's my love. I grew up around touring car racing, and in my days in Australia, open wheelers weren't a thing. Still aren't a thing in Australia, to be honest. We had Formula 5000s, which were big V8 powered open wheelers, which used to break down more than they'd finish. But that was about it. You know, touring car racing was always the #1 motorsport in Australia in my lifetime.
And Peter Brock, obviously touring car legend in Australia, bigger figure, more famous, more of a household name in Australia than Alan Jones was, the first Australian or second Australian to win the Formula 1 World Championship.
By a factor of 10. You know, Peter was absolutely, literally a household name. And Peter was the guy I was in partnership with in a race team in Australia. He's a very close friend of mine. And yeah, he would walk down the street and be mobbed. You know, he wasn't just a motor racing personality. He was a personality in his own right. And you actually can't relate to that. I've never seen that over here. It would probably be the same as if Lewis Hamilton walked down Regent Street. He'd get mobbed. So would Peter.
Yeah.
So, yeah, touring car racing in Australia was big. So it was only natural when I came over here, I gravitated towards the British Touring Car Championship.
And do you think, you may or may not accept this, but I'm asking the question because I think it might be true. You know, you fell in love with touring cars back in Australia, worked in them first of all in junior positions and then worked your way up in the way you've described, became friendly with and worked with Peter Brock, and then came here. Did you, in a sense, try to bring and imprint upon the British touring car scene that kind of positive tribalism that you'd seen in Australia?
That's exactly what I did. So when I came over here, I didn't come over here to do anything to do with motorsport. I came here because I just sold out of the race team in Australia with Peter. I just got divorced. They weren't linked at all, but for the first time...
We won't be asking you about your love life, don't worry.
For the first time in a very long time, I was single. And I came over here in 1990. I knew Andy Rouse, who was then a big figure in the BTCC, because our race team back in Australia bought race cars off him. We bought Ford Sierras off him, and Andy came out to race at Bathurst with us a couple of times. So I knew Andy, and Andy, when I came over, I went and had a cup of coffee with Andy. He said, "Come and work for me." So I had nothing planned other than I was living in a very nice flat in Pont Street in Knightsbridge, which is a fantastic...
just behind Harrods?
Just behind Harrods, which is a great introduction to living in London. But the flat was owned by a very good friend of mine, Alan Moffat, who's another big star in Australian touring car racing. He owned a flat in Pont Street, never used it, but gave me the key and said, "Go there, stay there as long as you wish," which was a great start to everything. So anyway, I came over here, had a cup of coffee with Andy. Andy said, come and work for me. So I went and worked with Andy. So I then started to get involved in his race team with the BTCC, and I saw that you could do a lot more with the BTCC than how it was being conducted. It was then promoted by the Royal Automobile Club Motorsports Association.
RAC-MSA.
Correct. So they were the governing body. They weren't really the promoter. They recognised they weren't really good at promoting sports, but in those days they weren't really individual race promoters in those days. It was always run by the governing body. So we approached them about taking over the rights. They gladly said yes, as long as we pay them what they're currently earning out of the championship, and the rest is history.
And you actually ended up being chairman of the RAC-MSA anyway.
Yeah, funnily enough, it's poacher turned gamekeeper. So yeah, eventually, so 10 years later, 13 years later, I became chairman of the MSA, and I was for 12 years.
And it's now called Motorsport UK, and David Richards heads it up.
And David Richards it's sliding doors and relationships within motorsport. David was one of my original partners in TOCA, who run the British Touring Car.
It's a small world.
It is motorsport's a very small world, at a certain level in this country. So David was a competitor in the BTCC. He ran the BMW team in the BTCC.
In the Steve Soper type of time.
Frank Sittner, all that sort of stuff. So both Andy Rouse, David Richards, a guy called David Cook, who's running the Vauxhall team, another guy called Vic Lee, who's running a privateer team, and myself, we all got together and took ownership of it. And as I said, I eventually, you're right, I forgot all that. I eventually became chairman of the MSA. And then when I was meant to do 9 years, I ended up doing 12 years. And then when my time finished, David became the next chairman.
Now, we mentioned Formula One. Obviously, the BTCC is a fantastic championship, but Formula One is the pinnacle of global motorsport. Has been. Some would say. Well, are you challenging that?
No, I'm not. But there are some people that would challenge.
But you enjoy Formula One, don't you?
Of course I do.
And you watch the races when you can?
So I've got a very short attention span. So I'll watch the race up until the point where I find
I'm surprised you've managed to listen to me this long.
I'm struggling.
You're getting bored now, aren't you?
I've got a very short attention span, so I'll watch the Formula One race up until the point where it becomes boring. Sometimes that can be on lap 2.
Yes.
Sometimes that can be halfway through the race. Sometimes that can be never. I might watch it all the time, but I won't religiously sit down and watch a Formula One race. I'll watch it whilst it holds my interest.
You and I often, we always send each other texts, about everything.
Yep.
Not just motor racing, but life,
politics,
all
Brexit,
sorts.
Do you want to talk about the B word?
We'll have to add an hour. But anyway, we talk about everything, and we always have, and we're mates. But we do talk about Formula One. Not so much did you see, that accident between Kevin Magnussen and Checo Perez, although we do sometimes talk about that, but often the background politics, what's going on with the teams. But in terms of Formula One, do you think there are lessons? I'm going to ask this, and you might be too modest to answer, but you might not be, that Formula One could learn from other series, including the BTCC. Prior
to Liberty taking over, I would have said absolutely yes. But I think Liberty have done such a fantastic job with Formula One. And when they first came in, we all thought, I'm sure you were too, we're all sceptical that this is just an American mob that are going to pillage the place and walk away with a bunch of money. But they've done a fantastic job on Formula One, with certainly those parts of Formula One that they're only responsible for, so the promotion and everything else. They've done a fantastic job on Formula One.
And by the way, I agree with you.
Yeah. So is there something they could do? No. In fact, it's the other way around. You look at what they've done, and there's a lot of things that they do I wish I could do if I had the deep pockets that they do, because they've invested a lot of money, and now they're getting the big returns. Prior to Liberty taking over, yeah, absolutely, because Bernie, who was fantastic and got Formula One to where it was, he sort of got to a glass ceiling as far as where marketing and promotion of Formula One.
Well, he was in his 80s, let's be honest, at that point. He's in his 90s now.
Correct. So but he also didn't give other people, he didn't bring in people that knew better than him in those areas and give them free rein. And that's a telling part of any boss is, and we were having this discussion before we started recording this, is the people that are very good at delegating responsibility to other people who know better than themselves in that area. And Bernie would never delegate responsibility to someone that knew anything different to him. So that's why it hit that class ceiling for a while, because that's the way Bernie was the ultimate control freak, and it was his decision. I mean, you've worked in Formula One for decades, so you know what Bernie's attitude was towards social media and new media and everything else. It was prehistoric.
Dinosaur.
Correct. So yes, but no, there's absolutely nothing that Liberty could learn from me. They've done such a fantastic job. So, and of course, the other thing is, if I had their money to spend, the BTCC could be massive. They very rarely misstep, and what they do, everyone could learn from them. I'll put a codicil to the fact that if they had that sort of money, because you look at what they do and you think, I couldn't replicate any of that. And even if I had 10% of that budget, it wouldn't be successful then, because you couldn't do it unless you had a big budget to do it with. So if you tried to replicate some element of what they do with 2 and tuppence instead of the 50 million they'd throw at that particular element, it would be a failure. So you've just got to understand where you can go in this world.
Cut your cloth accordingly.
Yeah.
You're Australian, we've mentioned that.
Did you notice?
Yes. Your accent is not quite as strong as it was when I first met you, probably 25 years ago.
Well, you'd hope it wouldn't be.
Well, you've been living in Stockbroker Belt in Surrey that long.
Yeah. But I never had a broad Australian accent anyway. I come from Melbourne, which is...
You're a very refined person.
I don't think Australian and refined go in the same thing, but I never had a really broad country Australian accent anyway.
Anyway, you are Australian, but you've lived in the UK for donkey's years. So I'm going to ask you a very different, because we're coming to the end, a very different kind of silly question, if you like. Your local team, run by actually your mate, Zak Brown, is McLaren, local because you live not very far from the factory. And they've got one Australian driver, Oscar Piastri, and one British driver, Lando Norris. Who do you support?
So you'll think this is a cop-out, but I equally support them, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Lando Norris used to race in our support series in the BTCC, so he came up through Ginetta Juniors and everything else.
At Formula 4 and so on.
Yeah. He's also the nephew of the chap that owns at Croft Circuit, where we go and race. So I knew Lando, I knew his family, his wider family, and I'll also take the accolades, if you like, I introduced Lando's father, Adam, to Zak Brown, and that got the McLaren Zak Lando Norris relationship going. So
which is now super successful.
Correct. So I take a bit of pride in that I introduced them both. So I've got not skin in the game, but some delight in seeing Lando's success, because he was part of the BTCC support package, and I introduced Oscar. He comes from Melbourne, so he's since Alan Jones, he's the first Australian driver that's come from Melbourne. So a hometown boy, if you like. So obviously,
because you're from Melbourne.
I'm from Melbourne. So hometown boy. So obviously, I support him as well, more than I've probably supported other Formula One drivers from Australia before.
More, for instance, than Daniel Ricciardo or Mark Webber.
Correct. I have more of an. It's again, it's tribalism. He comes from my tribe in Melbourne. So it's not a cop-out, but the answer is I actually support them both, and I'm actually equally happy when both of them do well.
And they're both doing well quite often, most of the time.
Doing fantastically well.
Brilliant.
So unfortunately, you didn't get the reaction to that answer that you're looking for.
Well, you didn't choose one or t'other.
No.
You're too
There was no
well-versed.
cop-out, but there's a very good reason for it.
You justified your cop-out with some data.
Not a cop-out.
That's what I'm calling it.
Okay.
Not a cop-out.
Not a cop-out.
Okay, moving on to another subject. As I say, we're coming close to the end. We've talked about sustainability, we've talked about environment, and a subject that often comes up in connection with that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. That includes all sorts of different types of people who should be welcomed and embraced into motorsport, whether they want to watch it as fans, work in it as mechanics or engineers or photographers or journalists or anything else,
Yep.
or of course drivers. So one of the obvious minorities in our sport is women. As you know, I worked in W Series for a couple of years, which was successful between 2019 and 20.
So successful only when you were there, is that what you're saying?
It was successful throughout the period I was involved and then became unsuccessful. Bit like the BTCC, except I was there for 3 years and you've been there for 33 years. So you do trump me, I know that. By the way, we don't like Donald Trump either.
No.
Made that clear.
It's another one of our text discussions.
But women, what do you think could be done, and in that case should be being done, by motorsport in general, the FIA, Formula One, the BTCC if you like, but in a concerted effort, Motorsport UK, whoever you want to list, to encourage more women to participate?
Define participation. If you're talking about drivers, that's a totally different subject.
Well, let's talk about both.
Okay, so there are many more women working in motorsport now than I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I'm sure you're the same. And I'm not just talking about women in, administrative or PR or marketing positions.
There always were marketers or PR women.
Yep. And in that respect, they probably outnumbered the men in that part of motorsport. But you go down through the pit lane at a BTCC event, the amount of female engineers in each team is fantastic. We've got senior engineers and senior car engineers in some teams which are female. Every team has female engineers, and that's fantastic. So the amount of women involved in motorsport has grown exponentially over the last, pick a number,
Which
20
is to
years.
be celebrated.
Which is, of course, to be celebrated. And we do a lot of things to encourage that as well. We have kids in motorsport programs and everything else where we get local schools along, girls and boys, schools along to show them about being involved in motorsport and the STEM environment that they can get involved in. And that's all long-term plays. And we've been doing it for so long, perhaps we have people working in our garages now that are a result of that. I'd like to think so. So I don't have any issue with women working motorsport. I think we're ticking that box fantastically. And not just women, but people from other ethnicities and everything else. But you'll inevitably start talking about women drivers. Women drivers have always had an equal opportunity in motorsport. Always have. That they've decided not to take it up until the last few years when there's been more of a concerted effort to do it is I don't understand, because there's been no barriers to entry of females in motorsport. A car does not know the gender of the person that's driving it, just doesn't. So the equipment you've got is exactly the same as a woman that a man has. I think a lot of it's just mindset, we've had plenty of women in the BTCC, racing in the BTCC over the years. Gosh, when I first came to this country in 1990, we had a Swedish woman called Nettan Lindgren, who was driving a BMW back in those days in the BTCC. We've always had women driving in the BTCC. We had a BTCC class champion, because it was classes in those days, in 1989, I think it was, called Louise Aitken-Walker.
She was in rallying to
She's a rally
start
driver
with.
and then went into racing. So having a woman in racing in our series is no big deal.
And more recently, you've had Jessica Hawkins, for instance, and others.
Jade Edwards and I. So a couple of years ago, we had 2 women in our series. So there's never been any barriers to entry for females to coming into the BTCC, on track or off track. And honestly, it's no big deal. We've had so many women drivers that I keep on forgetting their names, but over the last 30 odd years, we've had so many female drivers that it's clearly not a big deal to race in the BTCC as a female.
And do you think they could win?
Of course they can win.
There's no reason not.
Of course they can. There's absolutely, well, Louise Aitken-Walker won her class back in 1989. And as I said, a BTCC car is not like a Formula One car. It's not so physically demanding. Our races are 25 minutes long. So you don't have to be at the peak of your physical condition and have arms the size of steel girders to race a BTCC.
So in other words, the delta in strength between a fit man and a fit woman is not performance critical to racing a BTCC car?
Absolutely not.
No. So it'd be interesting to see whether it happens, because it'd be nice if it did happen.
If what happens?
A woman becoming a BTCC champion one day.
I think it's just inevitable, because, as I said, if the right driver is in the right car, it doesn't matter about the gender, because the car doesn't know what gender you are. If the right driver with the right amount of talent is in the right car for that year, and with the right team, you'll win.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what gender you are.
Yeah. It'll be great to see, and I hope it does happen in the next few years. So last year was a great season. This year, I think we probably agree, has been a better season. Next year, better again?
You'd like to think so, because every year we tweak the regulations, both technical regulations and sporting regulations, to fill in any holes that we have, and to make the racing as good and as exciting as we can. So, at the end of every season, in a few weeks' time, we sit down with the teams. We have an annual teams meeting with ourselves, and we look at any aspect of the regulations that we need to tweak or get rid of or bring in or whatever, in order for one thing and one thing only, is to make the racing the most competitive that you can get. And that's all we concentrate on. So we will inevitably make some tweaks to our regulations for next year. I don't know what they are. I've got a few ideas in my mind already, but some of them might be a bit crackpot. And until I sense check it with the teams, it may not be a runner. But there's a few regulation tweaks we will make next year. So there's no reason why next year's championship can't be equally as exciting as this year's. Absolutely no reason at all, and hopefully even better.
Perfect. Bring it on. Alan, I know you don't shake hands. Fist bump. Thank you.
Pleasure.